How was everybody's first day at the conference? All right. So my name is Nick Seeger. I work at Sun. I was tapped to do this at the very last second, and those of you who went to RailsConf in Portland may recognize the title of this talk from Charles Nutter's talk. So I was sort of handed this because they had to print the programs, and so I didn't have time to think of anything. And I kind of wondered, I've only been at Sun for a little over a year. Sun is a huge company, by the way, if you haven't figured that out. And I really don't know all that much about what's going on at Sun outside of my own little world. So I thought I'd maybe change up the talk a little bit to meet someone at Sun you don't know. And so that would be me. And I figured since I don't usually like to talk a lot about myself, but I figured that's something I should know pretty well, that I'd go ahead with that. So, like I said, my name is Nick. I'm a member of the JRuby team, and I've been doing work on JRuby for a couple years now. I also work on lots of the Rails-related bits that support JRuby on Rails. But I'm also a Rails programmer. And this is important to me because, yeah. Check out all those CRTs. Isn't that insane? I'm also a Rails programmer, and this is important to me because it means that all the work I do on the side in open source is supported by something real. And if I had one piece of advice I'd give all of you tonight, it's always make sure that what you're working on is grounded in something concrete. Don't let yourself wander off and get caught up in the what-ifs and, oh, wouldn't that be great if, because that day may never come. So anyway, I'm really excited to say that I'm actually a Rails programmer at Sun, which is a surprisingly rare thing these days. Hopefully that will change in the future. And the Rails project I've been working on is actually going to hopefully be live soon. I'll actually give you the live version here. This is actually the test of the staging site. So this is a real site. We've been running on it actually for about 6 months. It's a developer collaboration site called Project Keenai. And it's a Rails application. It's built with JRuby and runs on Glassfish. And what we've got here today is a very, very small, clean slate. We're starting really simple, and we'll hope to build from there. And so what this does for us is it allows us to build some credibility in the area of building web apps. Sun has typically been a server and software infrastructure company. And so what this says, hopefully, is that, hey, we're working on this. We're learning how to build web apps. We're learning how to use Rails. And we're also, since we do have software to offer along with it, we want to make sure that that stack is optimized well for working with Rails. So we'll hope to be going live really soon. When the site goes live, it'll be open to everybody to use, but only to a certain number of invitees to actually register and create projects there. So if any of you are interested in helping us out beta test the site, please come and see me, and I'll give you some pointers. So I better go back to the slides now. Another thing I've been doing is contributing back to Rails itself. And in fact, a connection pooling patch I just did got merged in last night into Edge, and hopefully we'll go into 2.2 as part of the work to make Rails 2.2 thread safe. And so I personally could really appreciate your help in trying out Edge and making sure that this code works fine with your apps if you happen to track Edge very closely. And let me know how that works. So as long as we're on the topic of concurrency and thread safety and Rails 2.2, I thought I'd go down a little path and talk about that a little bit. And so the question I'm sort of thinking about is, well, why is Rails only becoming thread safe now? Why didn't it start that way? And I actually exchanged emails with David a couple months ago on this very topic, and one of the answers he gave back to me was that concurrency is hard. And I think that's actually a fair answer. If any of you have ever done any concurrent programming, you know that lots of crazy things can happen. How many times have you seen a comment like this in some source code? In fact, you can go to Google Code Search and you'll see pages after pages of code full of that stuff, right? And so there's some inherent uncertainty in the way that programs run when you have multiple threads running at the same time. And I think David was sort of speaking to the idea that, well, if we didn't have to worry about that sort of thing, let's just forget all about it. And I'd say, that's great. If you can avoid to worry about it, if you can keep from having to worry about it, then that's great. But if you do want to tread into those waters a little more gently, you could start to bone up on what it means to do concurrent programming. So just to give you a small example, here's a Ruby class with a lazy sort of singleton that initializes an object that we're saying is expensive to create. Now, let's kind of go down a hypothetical path now where we have some really futuristic Ruby 2 point whatever runtime that has some crazy amounts of optimizations in it. And let's expand this out a little bit. So now instead of an or equals, we'll actually have the unless instance and instance equals. And then let's consider a case where the Ruby VM actually inlines the new method. So then you get something like this, where you're actually creating an object in one step, but you're initializing it in a second step. Now, what happens if you call this method with 2 threads at the same time? Well, the first thread would come in, and instance would be nil, so it's going to go inside this unless block, and then it's going to create this expensive create object and start to call initialize on it. Well, the second thread might become long, and it might come to this unless and then say, oh, and maybe the first thread is paused right here on this line, and the instance variable just got assigned to. And so now the second guy says, oh, well, that exists already. And he's going to fall through, and he's going to go back and use it. But meanwhile, the first thread is still sitting on this initialize with a big, long initialization process. And now you've got a weird edge case where you have an object that's not fully initialized that is now being used by another thread. So this is one example of the kind of kooky things that can happen when you get into concurrent programming. And so a general response to this is if you want to do this kind of thing, you should avoid shared state and lazy initialization, just as a baseline. There's obviously lots of other things you can do. You can get into the whole discussion about doing locking and so forth. But ideally, if you can just avoid these things altogether and be eager with your initialization and try to share as little as possible in memory, you'll be best off. And a good example of this is actually a change that happens that was made in Rails 2.2 for Action Pack, where in production mode, we're actually preloading. I shouldn't say we, I didn't do the patch. In production mode, Rails is actually preloading all of your application classes at startup so that we avoid these lazy initialization issues with the dependency mechanism. And of course, the problem with Mott's Ruby as is today is that this behavior is fairly difficult to observe with green threads. Usually the way that threads are context switched just doesn't allow you to really see this kind of behavior. However, there is another Ruby implementation I'm familiar with that does have native threading and would allow you to see these kinds of issues. And so, oddly enough, JRuby is in a great position to be able to take advantage of these new features in Rails 2.2. And so, as a trailer onto that, I want to say, so for me, the Rails 2.2 release means 2 big things for JRuby. The concurrency issue is one thing, and then I thought I'd just give you a flavor of another thing that JRuby can do for you to offer you an alternative way to consider deployment. And this is using, it's going to do a little demo here. This is using a tool that I wrote for JRuby called Warbler. And what it does is it basically creates a web application archive of your Rails application. I'm just going to go and run, I have a few different apps here. So I actually have a hypothetical Rails app here, and I'm going to create the WAR file for it, and I'm going to deploy it. So I'll get that started, and then, oh, actually, I'm supposed to go to this. I was supposed to set this up better than that. Here, check this out. I have this really cool slide to set this up. Yeah. I'm going to spin multiple plates and keep them spinning. OK, that was the setup. Sorry, I botched that. OK, so this guy is deploying. I've got a Rails app here that's going to be deployed to Glassfish, Java application server. Now over here, I have a hypothetical MERB app, and I'm going to warble this and deploy it. And now that's working. I'm going to go over here, and I've got a camping app. Anybody catching on to the theme behind these names? That's not quite right. Did I do that one? And then I've got a Sinatra app here. So let's see, those all appear to deploy successfully. We'll just wait for this one. All right, so meanwhile, I'm going to go over here and go to So there's the Rails app running. And there's the MERB app. And there's, ooh, yes. Okay. That was supposed to be the camping app. But I'm not going to debug it now. And there's the Sinatra app. So what you've just seen here, although I did do a little bit of hand waving, is 4 different Ruby web frameworks running in a single Java application server. And I use the almost identical command to create all 4 packages and deploy them in there. Obviously, I'm omitting some details, and these are really simple, trivial apps, but it gives you the flavors for some of the power of things you might be able to do with JRuby. And also, just a footnote on that, this feels really ugly to say this, but I just deployed a 7 megabyte Sinatra app into an app server. Is that enterprisey or what? All right, so that's pretty much all I have to say. I just want to say nice to meet you all, and come up and talk to me, and I'd be happy to talk at any point about JRuby or Glassfish or Keenai, Project Keenai, or anything else I talked about today. Thanks a lot.